Good evening, everyone. Welcome you all once again for the UOH History Webinar Series 10. Today we have very fascinating scholar, Malavika Kasturi. She'll be today speaking to us on debating caste and Ramarajya in Nehruvian India, reflecting on Swami Karpatri. Uh, uh, yeah, let me first briefly introduce Dr. Malavika. Dr. Malavika is Associate Professor in Department of History at the University of Toronto, Canada. She has been working on the, parampara of gurus and, matas for a long time. I mean, so she has actually published quite a lot on various aspects of matas and gurus. But her primary book, in a way, classic book, embattled identities, Rajput lineage and colonial state in 19th century North India, published by Oxford University Press in 2002, is a very important, significant work in many respect. Basically, in this book, she explores the Rajputs' encounter with colonial state and Rajput's negotiation with colonial states, particularly multiple identities through lineage and inheritance rights and other stuff. And now I think she said with us that she has done a manuscript and it is on gurus and Hindutva, sadhus, sampradaya, and the making of Hindu nationalism in 20th century India. And I think she would be, whatever she is offering to us now is basically, I think, from this work. She has actually published a lot in various journals and edited volumes. I don't want to go into all the details, but I'll just mention some of the important articles. The one which published in Modern Studies in 2018 is Gurus and Gifting, Dana and Mata Reform Campaign and Hindu Sangatin in 20th century India. There is another article published in Modern Asian Studies entitled Ascetizing Monastic Families, Ascetic Genealogies, Property, Feuds, and Anglo-Hindu Law in Late Colonial India. She has also published one article in Indian Economic and Social History Review, which is also titled as All Gifting is Sacred, the Sanatana Dharma Sabha movement, civil society, and the reform of Dana in late colonial India. She has also published some articles in edited volumes as well. One is in Narayani Gupta and Pardo Datta edited volume, Urban Spaces in India. The title of her chapter is Negotiating the Sacred in 20th Century Gorakhpur, the Nitya Yogis, the Gorakhnath Mat, and contested urban spaces. There is another edited, I mean, a chapter in edited volume entitled This Land is Mine, Mahant, Civil Law and the Political Articulations of Hinduism in 20th Century North India. This is published in Filing Religion, State, Hinduism, and a Code. This is also published by Oxford University, Press. These are some of the samples. There are, I think, a lot of articles which are in a pipeline in with various level in various journal. But what she is going to offer today is a very interesting topic. You all must be know, I mean, or at least heard Swami Karpatri, who is a very important personality in the post-independent India, in particularly engaging with various Hindutva politics and all, particularly his movement against Hindu civil code, as well as anti cow slaughter movement and all that. So I think, yeah, without any much delay, we'll straight away request Dr. Malavika to speak. And for today's lecture, my colleague Professor Anandita Mukhopadhyaya would be moderating this session. So over to Anandita, and then.
Thank you.
Anindita, please unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Bhangia. I invite Malavika to speak now. Her talk will be debating caste and Ram Rajya in Nehruvian India. Please speak, and I will see what's your argument.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak at the University of Hyderabad webinar series. I mean, this is really comes at a very comes at a very important point for me as I'm sort of finalizing my manuscript and actually thinking about Karpatri in terms of this my larger research, which is on the unpredictable intersections between monasticism and the two distinct bodies propagating political Hinduism at in the with whom he had an association from the late 1940s, that is the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS, right? So my larger work, and I'm going to be speaking about some aspects of it today, in my chapter on Swami Karpatri, it situates his perspectives on Varnashrama Dharma and his particular engagement with Ram Rajya, which is a utopia, quote unquote, evoked both by Gandhi as well as the Kisan Sabha, drawing on Tulsidas' Ramcharitmanas in various ways to understand how it reflected his engagement with the world of Dashnami monasticism. During my research in Banaras, Swami Karpatri's name came up repeatedly. So, it was, he repeatedly, by the Dashnami sadhus that I interviewed in Banaras, many of whom spoke of him as a Dharmrakshak or a Dharm Samrat, who launched a variety of agitations, not only in Uttar Pradesh, but also in Delhi, to preserve Dharma. They also spoke of, in fact, their own participation in many of these movements, which included his agitation against the Untouchability Prevention Act in the 1950s, and in the various constructive agitations, quote unquote, that occurred alongside with participation from the RSS, and this includes the agitation against the Hindu Code Bill from 1948 well into until 1954, and of course before the Cow Slaughter Act, which was in the 1960s, a number of other cognate agitations that were continuous in Delhi. against a variety of issues. Karpatri's Ram Rajya Parishad, which he forms, which is sort of really, really important, and which will be an important part of my argument, also participated in the Praja Parishad movement and sent Dandi sannyasis from a vast number of mathas to which he was connected, to participate in movements that were organized by the RSS. And in fact, many of my interviewees, in fact, speak of being jailed alongside him from 1948. So Karpatri himself was a sannyasi from the complex Dashnami Shaiva religious tradition or Sampradaya, whose associations the Akhil Bharatiya Dharmasang formed in 1943, and the political party, the Ram Rajya Parishad 1948, in fact, had a very ambiguous relationship with the RSS. And I'm sort of going to argue that, in fact, there were very few religious traditions and in fact gurus and gosains in this period who in fact joined hands with the RSS. And Swami Karpatri is one who actually stands out, together with Baba Digvijayanath of the Gorakhnath Mutt, who in fact openly engages with the RSS, but as I'm going to suggest, on sort of in very ambivalent terms. And in fact, after 1954, he parts ways, although he does join, and he did attend sessions of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, which was formed in 1964. So so he's a very important figure in the in this period. But what is equally sort of important is the trove of the Ramcharitmanas that he draws on, right? So in fact, Karpatri is known in Banaras as someone who was actively propagated the Ramcharitmanas, wrote commentaries on the same, and in fact evoked the topos of Tulsidas's Ramcharitmanas. So this is a very, very important engagement, and I'm going to be looking at the particularities of his engagement with the Ramcharitmanas, which is of course a very different one to the ones that were sort of evoked by Gandhi, for example. And so in many ways, the Ram Rajya that is evoked in Karpatri's understanding is very, very different from that evoked by Gandhi, and very, very different from that evoked by the Kisan Sabha, right, in the 1920s. So what I'm going to be focusing on is Karpatri, and I'm going to be focusing on his particular engagement and the way he connects the Ramcharitmanas and his understanding of Ram Rajya Parishad, to his understanding of Ram Rajya, to a particular understanding of politics and society, which in fact is propagated by the Ram Rajya Parishad. So I'm going to be really sort of looking at this in four main sort of, I'm going to try and mark it out in four main ways. First, I want to place Swami Karpatri in the very complex and hierarchical world of Dashnami monasticism, which was actually very much fractured by caste. And this is very important for us to understand Karpatri's engagement as a Dandi sannyasi, which in the Dashnami Sampradaya was in fact the one of the, and I'll go into that in a minute, was in a world that was itself deeply fractured by caste. So it is important to note that Karpatri therefore is positioning himself as a Dandi sannyasi at a time when caste conflict is escalating within the Dashnamis and within the Ramanandis and so on, and at a point when the Hindu Sangathan campaign, in fact, is kind of also engaging with the question of caste. It's whether it's the Congress, the Arya Samaj, and even the Hindu Mahasabha for that matter, with very different positionings, of course, engaging with the question of caste. And so Karpatri is in fact beginning to navigate and express his political language and the association with which he's connected, coming from this sort of socio-political and religious universe of Dashnami monasticism. So after that, I'm going to be sort of talking about the ways in which Karpatri then connects his understanding of caste and politics in his own political activity. When he joins Guru-based organizations like the Bharat Dharma Mahamandal, of which I spoke and I've published elsewhere, as well as other cognate organizations in which, in fact, a lot of Brahmin Gosains across religious traditions are playing a very important part. And that includes the Varnashrama Swarajya Sangh that was formed around the moment of the 1920s, but actually came together when the temple entry movement was begun by Gandhi. And in fact, Karpatri is a very important part of and a member of the Varnashrama Swarajya Sangh. Then in the then of course in the 1940s, he goes on to form the Dharmasang and the Ram Rajya Parishad. So I will be talking a little bit about that. And then I want to focus very specifically, after lingering on his ideas of Ram Rajya, which for him was very political, obviously, and was linked to his political campaigns that he in fact spearheaded when the Ram Rajya Parishad participated in the elections. First as part of a united Hindu front, along with the Jan Sangh and the Hindu Mahasabha, and then separately after they broke ties. And central to this understanding for Karpatri as an orthodox Dandi sannyasi was the joining of the Ramcharitmanas and Ram Rajya to a very problematic understanding of Varnashrama Dharma and caste, and which he called the orthodox way of life. So, so in so doing, I not only want to talk more about, I want to place not this world of Dashnami monasticism and the kind of and the Dandi sannyasis, and connect their engagement, which was very, very fractious, with the RSS. I want to, in certain ways, say that this points to an extremely, in a way, something that I'm trying to do. It speaks to the larger concern of my book project, which is to sort of look at the intersecting but very fractious and ambivalent relationship between this world of religious traditions and the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha. So having said that, I'd just like to move on first and talk about Karpatri and the Dashnami Sampradaya. I am actually here sort of drawing on a variety of work, including Vijay Pinch, who has actually done wonderful work on the Dashnamis, as well as Matthew Clark. But what my interest here is sort of a different one. I'm trying to understand the ways in which these religious traditions were engaging with not only the changing public sphere of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but the ways in which they were also forming associations at this point in time, and how they were actually attempting to, in fact, carve a space and shape debates on the idea of on modern in modern enunciations of Hinduism, whether by the Arya Samaj or by the Sanatan Dharma Sabhas, or by political formations enunciating political Hinduism, like the Hindu Mahasabha and then the RSS, all of whom, in fact, saw both caste as well as Sampradaya as pernicious and obstacles in their path to achieving, on the one hand, what shall we say, united for the Arya Samaj and for the Sanatana Dharma. It was very important to subsume Sampradaya and religious traditions within a master narrative of an enunciation of Hinduism. So in fact, Sampradaya was just a part which in fact religious traditions were very sort of engaged with very vigorously and refuted, which I'm not going to be talking about at great length in this in this talk, but it is something that undergirds this entire period. And the second one is the engagement with the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS, which again, in fact, viewed both Sampradaya and caste. And in this case, it's very important too, because the Dasnamis were religious traditions embedded in caste practices, right? And hierarchical caste practices, and Karpatri exemplified that. So therefore, there was this tension, even though he in fact engages and in fact is very sympathetic to many of their ideas, and in fact works with them. So I am not going to be engaging with the engagement of Karpatri with the Akhand Bharat campaign, for example, or his engagement with Ram Janmabhoomi, which is a completely different paper. But I do want to sort of say that, you know, there is this side to him as well, which are also problematic. But so he's a very, very complex and very important person. And so hence, I think it's quite important for us to know about the Dasnamis. So the Dasnamis themselves were part of the world of Sampradaya, which in much scholarship, except with notable exceptions, seems to disappear in discussions of, you know, sort of, shall we say, whether the late 19th and early 20th century was one of reform or revival. And I think that it is important for us to move beyond this by sort of putting the space and place of Sampradaya in the middle, especially in the public domain and in the public sphere, in the realm of these very, very heated debates. So he came from this world of multifarious Vaishnava, Shaiva, and Shakta religious traditions of teaching and transmission, passed through ascetic lineages from monastic teachers to their disciples, which revolved around charismatic leaders known as gurus, ghosains, mahants, and peers. So Karpatri, of course, was associated with the Dasnamis, a very important Shaiva Sampradaya with a dominant presence in not just in North India, but in fact, their mathas were, in fact, and their networks stretched well beyond the boundaries of the British Empire, because the Dasnamis were also not just religious specialists, but they were also very important mercantile actors, financiers, landlords, etc. And it was into these monastic networks that Karpatri was going to tap. So the Dasnamis were linked in hagiographies with Shankara and the four pithas or elevated seats founded by him and his disciples in Puri, Dwarka, Govardhan, and Joshimath in the 10th century. And drew upon the idea in hagiographies that Shankara formed this ascetic order into 10 panths, united under one umbrella to form one religious tradition. So the fact, of course, in when the Dasnamis speak of themselves today, and when their sort of their history is presented, they speak of the order as the religious tradition as one that was in fact formed into these 10 panths from you know, from sort of, they trace their origins to Adi Shankaracharya, and some scholars have argued that in fact they can be traced as into being formalized into these 10 panths between the 16th to the 18th centuries. But even in the period that I have been looking at them, from 19th and 20th centuries, there seems to be a lot of internal discussion amongst Dasnamis about actually who they were, because in fact, what is sort of interesting is not only are they divided into 10 panths, but amongst that, they are sort of divided into three, if you like, strands, and that is the Dandis, or the scripture holders who wielded the staff, the Parahamsas, the pure, and the Nagas. And Swami Karpatri belonged to the Dandis, which was the most orthodox strand of the Dashnami religious tradition, and who were Brahmins and organized around Guru Parampara traditions based in mathas, and they were not formally tied to akhadas. Now, this is very, very important because both the Parahamsas as well as the Nagas were tied to military akhadas that, in fact, Vijay Pinch has shown to wonderful effect by the 18th century, where, in fact, they were part of the military labor market that Koff talks about, and which the East India Company, in fact, domesticates by the early 19th century. So we also know that the Parahamsas and the Nagas were very, very open-ended. We know that, in fact, by the late 19th century, by the middle of the 19th century, when they make the transition to from these, if you like, akhadas or military regiments, which is a very poor translation, into in fact different organizations, which in fact re-emerge in the 19th century as financiers, capitalists, and so on. One thing that is still which is very important and defines them is their distinction from the Dandi sannyasis. And what is interesting is, in all my interviews, it was the Dandi sannyasis who said that they were Smartha and not Shaiva, right? And as opposed to the Parahamsas and the Nagas, who openly said they were Shaiva. So there is, and who are also, in fact, expressed time and again that the differences in caste between the Dandis and the rest of the Dashnami sannyasis, and in fact spoke of commensality, different understandings of religious practices, of which there is in fact still a debate. So in fact, caste is very, very important amongst the Dashnamis. And so Karpatri, in fact, is part of this world where even in the 19th century, Dandi mathas, for example, were very, very separate from the Parahamsa and the Naga matha, the Parahamsa mathas, which were in fact, in 19th and early 20th century Banaras, most of the mathas, there is an explosion in mutts, and the most rich mutts are not the Dandi mutts. It is actually the Parahamsa mutts, and most of who in fact are mercantile bankers, they are traders, they are landlords, they are zamindars, and they are plugged into these sort of very vast monastic networks. So what is sort of interesting also in this period is not only must we see Swami Karpatri as an orthodox Hindu guru, but also as a Dandi sannyasi who is trying to regenerate and kind of find a space and place for Dandi sannyasis in this, in the world of Dashnami monasticism, where in fact the Dandis are have this very ambivalent relationship. And in fact, so in a way, it's very interesting that the Dandis, more than the other Dashnami sannyasis, choose to engage with the with the Orthodox Hindus and also with the RSS. So I think this is having said that, I would like to talk a little bit now about Harihar Anand Saraswati himself. Now, the period in which Harihar Anand Saraswati, who later came to be known as Swami Karpatri, is an important one. It's one in which gurus from religious traditions like the Dashnamis and the Dandis in particular, they established associations to engage with modern Hinduism, in which they had an uneasy place. And this is what is very important, is that until the Bharat Dharma Mahamandal is formed in 1901, in fact, a large number of these associations, which are seeking to either reform and rejuvenate Sampradaya or Hinduism is in fact dominated by members of middle class or professionals. So in other words, they're lay proponents in which Goswamis and Gosains are involved, but they're certainly not in the main leadership. This speaks to the fact that there was a very uneasy engagement with the world of Sampradaya and with gurus in particular. And here I might say with Shaiva gurus in particular, because the world of Orthodox Hinduism, which I'm particularly occupied with, given that Brahmin gurus and Dandi sannyasis like Karpatri, in fact, were in fact very, very hostile to the Arya Samaj, which in fact saw gurus and religious traditions as all that was antithetical to Vedic religion, and was in fact representative of the superstitions, the idolatry, and in fact the occult practices of tantric gurus, Shaiva gurus in particular, of in fact, if you like, coming in the way of, or you know, the which impurities had to be purged from Hinduism. So in fact, many Brahmin gurus like Karpatri joined projects that were part of what has been called Sanatana Dharma, or the eternal religion. Now, what is which not just me, I build here on Philip Dudgengoff, who actually shows that these were that there was no one uniform Sanatana Dharma movement. It was extremely, these were a set of very influential but disaggregated associations and political bodies. But what was very interesting, what I found when I delved into them, is that they were very divided, and they were shaped by Sampradaya. And in fact, a large number of them were Vaishnava, and they were extremely hostile to Shaiva gurus. So what is important is that when we look at Swami Karpatri, or Hari Anand Saraswati as he was first known, is that he in fact aims to negotiate with this hostility towards Shaivism, and so therefore separates himself in many ways from the and calls himself a Smartha Guru as opposed to a Shaiva, which also led to a lot of debates amongst the Dasnamis. So the important thing here is that we, unlike a lot of hagiographies about other charismatic leaders, the hagiographies which are produced about Karpatri, in fact, do not discuss him as a Shaiva. They talk of him largely as a Smartha Guru. And what is very important is that they disconnect him from the world of Dandi sannyasis and the sort of socio-religious practices with which he was actually in which he was very actively involved, and he was a leading proponent. And what is extremely interesting is that there is very little mention of the Dandis themselves. There is much more mention of Sanatana Dharma, and there is much more, and the third thing is that there is the references are to present him as a Rashtriya Sant or a Dharam Samrat. Right? So, which is in some senses to knowingly disconnect him from the Dasnamis, even though we know and he was very actively involved, and in fact a very important part of the Dasnami Kotwal, which is the Dandi Kotwal, which was the body which in fact monitored and the vast network of Dandi Mathas in Banaras and elsewhere. So Hari Anand himself is a very sort of important figure. What little we know about him is that he was born as Har Narayan in 1907 to a Suryapuri Brahmin family, which moved from Gorakhpur to Pratapgarh. So his life is presented as one in which he had prolific interest in scholarship when he was a child, with few ties from home, and was dedicated to to a life of tyag and vairagya, or detachment, and tapas, or discipline. While he was married, he is in all these accounts, he is supposed to have left home in 1923 and was ordained into the Dandi order of the Dasnamis by his guru Swami Brahmanand Saraswati, who is an important figure, whom we'll come back to later. So Hariharanand Saraswati is supposed to have moved to Banaras in 1923, where then he became very important in two different worlds. And they were, and one was the world of Dandi sannyasis, where in fact he is very, very engaged with the a large number of mathas, which in fact are extremely important. By 1861 and afterwards, Dandi sannyasis in Banaras and elsewhere were well noted as scholars of Tantra and Yoga. And in fact, though he presented himself as a Smarta Brahmin, a large number of Dandi sannyasis were and continue to be associated with Shaiva, Shakta, and Tantric forms of practice. So many of the Dandi mathas in which I conducted research, whether it was the Mashli Bandar Math or the Kali Math, etc., their presentation of their Mahants and Gurus is very different from the presentation of Karpatri, where they emphasize the tantric sadhana of their Gurus, and in fact they present them as visionary Siddha Yogas with extraordinary powers, which in fact Karpatri distanced himself from, although he is very, very much part of this world. And in fact, as he becomes more important, he not only becomes an important part of this Dandi Kotwal, as I said, but in fact, he becomes the Shankaracharya of the Sumeru Math, and he becomes a person who, within the Dandi sannyasis in the monastic tradition, he becomes a very important person who engages in the supervision of the Dandi Mahants, and he in fact is deeply involved in the Kali Math and so on and so forth. So Karpatri is not only part of this world, but then he also becomes part of another world by the 1920s, and that is, but he never loses, if you like, he remains deeply immersed with that of his own guru, that is the Shankaracharya of, that is Brahmanand Saraswati, who becomes the first Pithadeshwar of the Jyotirmath. And you can sort of see him there. And Karpatri himself, right from the 1920s onwards, he actually, once he becomes a well-known figure in his own right, he has a large number of gurus. He has a large number of bhakts, and many of them were princes, landlords, and others who were very much invested in the Council of States, and who were very much invested in a quote-unquote stable social order. And Karpatri, in fact, is funded by these, by his bhaktas, right from the 1920s and certainly after the 1940s, right? So the Machli, so he's connected organically, I just want to say, to this world of maths. So for example, the Mahant of the Machli Bandar Matha remembers, in fact, participating in many of Karpatri's agitations. And in fact, this is a Dandi Matha, and he said that in fact the Dandis then recruited and tried to recruit other sannyasis from this very heterogeneous Dashnami Sampradaya, which was in fact dominated and divided by caste. So, and so, so now I just want to actually talk more about the Karpatri's early career and sort of place it in the larger sort of frame of what is happening in the early 20th century. So Karpatri, after coming to Banaras, he in fact is also engaging with this world of Orthodox Hinduism and Sanatana Dharma, which is very active at this point in time. It is something that I've written about elsewhere. I can't go into it in great detail, but suffice it to say that the world of Sanatana Dharma had a very complicated relationship with the world of religious traditions and gurus. There was, broadly put, you can divide, and we can see that the Sanatanis, as I will call them for the rest of my presentation, were divided into two broad strands. One that was led by Madan Mohan Malaviya and Deen Dayal Sharma, who believed that Sampradaya was subsumed into this larger narrative of Sanatana Dharma, or the eternal religion, which was sort of really presented as inflected and saturated with Vaishnava language, and which was propagated in Kalyan and Gita Press, Gorakhpur. And what is important is that Karpatri was trying to engage with this world by his, in fact, propagation of the Ramcharitmanas, which by the 1920s and the 1930s, for many Sanatanis, had acquired a great deal of importance as one of the ur texts of Sanatana Dharma. So the idea of, so this was a very important trove, which he seeks to appropriate in a context where, as a Dandi sannyasi, he is trying to sort of, in many senses, negotiate and balance these different worlds. So Karpatri is part of this world then, when Dandi sannyasis embrace a large number of different forms, different associational forms, even as they are engaging with the Sanatana Dharma. And these are what I have called elsewhere guru-based associations, which in fact are formed to emphasize and protect the importance of particular religious traditions. So there are many different kinds of these associational forms that were formed by gurus as opposed to their bhaktas. And these were local associations that sought to reach out to devotional publics, but there were also regional mahasabhas that were particular to each religious tradition. And by no means were all of these, any religious tradition, homogeneous. There were a lot of inter-sectarian splits. And in fact, this is one of the sort of problems faced by these mahasabhas and these associations. And we can see that because they participated in the world of print. Right? And it is in print that we see a lot of the differences and boundaries of these within Sampradaya being negotiated and renegotiated once again. But what is very, very important and what binds all these associations together is the importance of the Guru. And Guru Bhakti. And in fact, Karpatri was part of a discourse which watched with dismay and was very critical of the Arya Samaj and the Sanatana Dharma, and on a different plane, the RSS, which sought to, in fact, replace religious traditions and, in fact, the Guru himself, and this particular tradition of the Guru Parampara tradition. So Karpatri begins by participating in the Bharat Dharma Mahamandala, which is formed by Dashnami and Saiva sannyasis, and it is funded by their monastic networks, right? And he is also very active in the organization that is formed specifically in 1924, the Varnashrama Swarajya Sangh, that is actually, if you like, a sister organization of the Bharat Dharma Mahamandala. And this is and in the mandate of the Varnashrama Swarajya Sangh was to, in fact, protect what they call the attack on the religious and the social order or Varnashrama Dharma by atheist organizations like the Congress, the Hindu Mahasabha, and the Arya Samaj. So what is very important also is that Karpatri is working with the Mahamandala and the VSS, and he's also working with a lot of caste sabhas who in fact come together on this platform, which is called the Brahman Mahasammelana. So in fact, Karpatri is a figure way before he forms the Dharmasang. In fact, he has a lot of traction. So right from the 1930s, Karpatri, together with the Mahamandala and the VSS, in fact, opposed the Hindu Sangathan campaign of the Hindu Mahasabha, particularly the Shuddhi campaign. They opposed the temple entry campaign. More importantly, they sort of vociferously targeted Gandhi, and in 1933 and 1934, and that is a whole different paper. But at the same time, they were fighting the attempts by a large number of groups across the board to reform and domesticate Sampradaya and the world of monasticism and mathas. So it is against this backdrop that Karpatri in fact forms the Dharmasang in 1943 and the Ram Rajya Parishad in 1948. So the Dharmasang as an organization is one that Karpatri forms. He says it is an Orthodox Hindu association. It is a Sanatani association. It is not just for for sannyasis, but importantly, just like the Bharat Dharma Mahamandala, it is largely made up of Saiva sannyasis and specifically Dandi sannyasis. And the Ram Rajya Parishad, interestingly, is the political organization that he floats, and it is one that is funded and it is underwritten by all his bhaktas and his patrons, many of whom are jagirdars and princes, who by 1948 were looking at the emergence of a post-colonial state where they found their interests were being threatened by the Zamindari Abolition Act, etc., etc. So what is interesting is that the Dharmasang and the Ram Rajya Parishad, in fact, become important platforms from which the Nehruvian state, not just secularism, but its sort of understanding and space and place of religion and property, etc., is attacked again and again. And what is important is both the Dharmasang as well as the Ram Rajya Parishad, in fact, place at the very center the idea of Ram Rajya. Right? That is, but a very specific understanding of Ram Rajya, which is this a very hierarchical civil society project that is in fact governed by Varnashrama Dharma and Karpatri's sort of understanding of Dharma. So in a way, and I just want to very briefly discuss here the Dharmasang, which was formed in 1948. The Dandi sannyasis formed the mainstay of both the Dharmasang and the Dharamveer Dal that was formed in Haridwar in 1948. And booklets announced that both the Sangh and the Dal were formed to protect Hinduism, monasticism, and religion. And Swami Karpatri, in fact, also established a Vidyalaya, a university, and an ashram, and he called for funds. He announced that the Dharmasang's aims were included the establishment of dharma or righteousness, the destruction of irreligiousness, adharma, and the re-establishment of Varnashrama Dharma, and putting an end to cow slaughter. Equally important was the establishment of a woman's wing that was modeled on the RSS's Durga Vahini Dal. So, and later on in 1951, when the Ram Rajya Parishad is formed, it also forms a women's wing, which was very active in campaigning both against Hindu Code Bill as well as the as well as the, Karpatri's agitation against the abolition of untouchability bill. So in all the forums that Karpatri forms, which was the Dharmasang Shiksha Mandal, which was the educational wing of the Dharmasang, the idea was to was to push a national project that was based on achieving this particular understanding of Ram Rajya. So it is pertinent to note in 1946 that the Dharmasang signed a series of petitions along with the Bharat Dharma Mahamandala as and when the ideas of the constitution were being discussed, and their petitions pleaded that power be transferred immediately into the hands of princes, given that India was a country with a religious constitutional monarch tradition unsuited to Western democracy and should have been, but rather should be run on the lines of Ram Rajya. So they also prayed for the nomination of the chief Sanatani and Sannyasi bodies to the Constituent Assembly and for the protection of their religious rights as religious minorities, and expressed the worry that leaving the future constitution to a Constituent Assembly based on mixed secular and casual electorates would have disastrous consequences given the attack on them by iconoclasts like the Indian National Congress and the Hindu Mahasabha on Hindu sacred spaces and its social system, underscored by Ram Rajya, which was based on Varnashrama Dharma. So it is so central to Karpatri's vision in which he propagates in a space where he's funded, and he sets up the Shiksha Mandal, he sets up the Karpatri Dham that you can see here, and then he sets up the Ramrajya Parishad, and he sort of what is very really important and what is very open is that this idea of Ram Rajya is very much linked to the vision of the sort of the princes around independence, and who openly said where Karpatri and his patrons said that they needed to fight against a communist state and the establishment of a classless society to which Nehru was wedded. So, Karpatri and the Ram Rajya Parishad warned again and again this meant the abolition of private property and the extinguishment of all landed proprietors who were the upholders of Varnashrama Dharma, along with Sampradaya and gurus like Swami Karpatri. And at the time that the Ram Rajya Parishad was formed, he bewailed the present as a Sankatkar and called repeatedly again and again for the return to a Ram Rajya, very different from that posited by Gandhi, very different to that posited by the Kisan Sabha. So this, because Ram Rajya becomes a sign, and in Karpatri's very particular understanding is also linked to an exposition of sort of linked to an exposition and a resurgence, if you like, of Dandi sannyasis. So I think this is sort of really very important to keep in mind when he actually, when we look at the constitution of the Ram Rajya Parishad, which is released in 1951, which vowed to reinstate a Dharma Rajya to protect religion and create a mutually beneficent relationship between different classes and castes and classes. In other words, Varnashrama Dharma. A just society, it argued, was one in which Rajniti was in the hands of Dharmacharyas, just like Ramachandra listened to Maharishi Vasishtha. The Ram Rajya Parishad insisted that without religion, politics would not be successful. So, and its aims also included the establishment of a space, a political space or a Ram Rajya where nobody was a Daridra Narayan, all individuals were contented, happy and gifted with learning, wealth, and where Dharma ruled and where all would be in their place as enshrined by the Manusmriti. So by the 1950s, the Ram Rajya Parishad in fact accepts democracy and the existence of Bharat as a sovereign state, but it is actually kind of it bewailed the destruction of what it called religious freedom, and and in fact swore that it would fight for sadachar and sanskar. And in this, it gets into two kinds of debates. And I'll very quickly sort of talk more, and this is what I sort of shift to now. So Karpatri's work is also sort of, therefore, he published on many, many platforms. He wrote a number of texts. He wrote, as I said, expositions on the Ramcharitmanas, but he also writes political texts. He also edited a newspaper called Sanmarg, which was very widely distributed. But here you can see one of the books that he wrote, that was Marxwad or Ram Rajya, which was published by Gita Press, Gorakhpur, and which had extremely wide readership. So in which he sort of course, and I'm sort of reducing his ideas and arguments, but I think it's very, very important, the fact that he's sort of connecting and yet disconnecting this world of Dashnami monasticism from
wrap up, Malavika.
Yeah. So so Karpatri is involved, and I'm going to very briefly say, so Karpatri leads a number of agitations in this period. One is against the Hindu Code Bill, which in fact is a lot has been written about, but all I'm going to say is that Karpatri in the Dharmasang and the Ram Rajya Parishad, in fact, work with the RSS at this point in time. And it's very interesting that there are many, many agitations. And in fact, it is the RSS, which is now in 1949, when it was banned, in fact, it piggybacks on the mass agitation of Dandi sannyasis and organizations like the All India Swarajya Sangh, who in fact opposed not only Ambedkar personally, but they opposed the Hindu Code Bill, arguing that it was, it was interfering with the deep-rooted socio-religious structures of different communities in the secular state of India. And it argued that it is strange that we have and sort of, and argued that they were vilified at castes and so on. And what is important is that there were a large number of public agitations against the Hindu Code Bill and against the liberal democratic state. And we can see, and in fact, what is really interesting is the public performance of a large number of Dandi sannyasis who come out on the street, and in fact the large number and the personal attack on Ambedkar himself, and Karpatri himself is jailed many, many times. And the other thing that Karpatri is very involved with, and I will finish up after this, is that he is part of, as I said earlier, movements led by the Varnashrama Swarajya Sangh, where he sought to protect, but not only the world of Dandi sannyasis, but the world of caste and the important position of Dandi sannyasis as Brahmins in Dandi mats, and in the at a time where in fact the world of the Dashnamis was also awash with the same kind of conversations about caste, about commensality, and in fact access to space and mats and its properties. Karpatri is especially agitated, and he agitated in the 1930s against the legalization of temple entry. He opposed Gandhi and the abolition of untouchability. And about after 1957, what I do want to kind of, what is very important is that Karpatri is at the spearheading of a movement where he builds a new Kashi Vishwanath temple only for Dandi sannyasis and his bhaktas. So between 1947 and 1954, in fact, Karpatri is arrested at least 5 times because he tries to stop the entry of Dalits to the Kashi Vishwanath temple. This is something that which made the Jan Sangh extremely uncomfortable, because this is the time when in fact they were trying to the Jan Sangh, which is formed in 1951, is actually trying to form a united Hindu front with the Ram Rajya Parishad and with Swami Karpatri. hoping that if in fact he came on board, then a large number of other gurus and members of religious traditions would join, because so far because they had had a very fractious relationship um, with the RSS and its associated bodies. So he starts his agitation and he forms this new Vishwanath Mandir in Banaras. And what is the controversial part of it is that he said the premise of the formation of this temple was that in allowing Dalits to enter the Kashi Vishwanath temple, he said that Ram Rajya itself had been sullied and its project had been its project had been compromised by the allowing of what he called the entry of those who could not be ordained according to the Manusmriti to enter sacred spaces and temples. So this new Vishwanath temple in Meerghat is a space where in fact there is a new performance of if you like, of what he called an orthodox Hinduism, but it becomes a space for Dandi sannyasis, and it is spaces like this in fact that become an embarrassment for Deen Dayal Upadhyay. So, and this is where I want to end. In fact, I had an entire section on the discussion of Bharatiya Sanskriti, but which I will skip, but I can answer in the question and answer session. It is at this point in time, it is in 1954, when in fact the Ram Rajya Parishad, the Dharmasang and Karpatri they part ways after very acrimonious debates on the space of caste and sampradaya in the making of Bharatiya Sanskriti. And these debates that they're having are with the Hindu Mahasabha and with the Jan Sangh, which at this point in time is very uncomfortable with Karpatri's sort of, if you like, open advocacy of separate temples, not just for Brahmins, but also for Dandi sannyasis. And so in fact, we can see, and this is where I'll conclude by saying, in fact, after Karpatri formally parts ways with the RSS, he writes a book which in fact is very, I'm sorry, I'm going to skip all this, but he writes this very important book called Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh or Hindu Dharm, in which he castigates the RSS and this book is written much after the VHP comes out, in which he castigates both for in fact service to an ideology which does not which eschews religion, which eschews dharm, which eschews sadachar, and he asked the question, of course, and it's a very loaded question given what I've said about his own understanding of Bharatiya Sanskriti and his understanding of Ram Rajya. He said, what kind of Sanskriti can there be devoid of religion, where in which the world of Tulsi Das's Ramcharitmanas has no place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malavika, for a brilliant presentation and a very scary one. Because we do see very strong similarities. In fact, it's almost a mirror version of Islamic State, right, which is beginning to color Karpatri's vision of an India which only looked at a certain community and treated other communities as unnecessary to a polity. So this is where I think I can make some rather sweeping generalizations about your brilliant paper. I really think it's a very important positioning of scholarship at a point in time when we can see a halfway line that has been accomplished, I guess, by a certain vision of a polity. But perhaps these are also, you know, inherent in visions of power, right? When we allow, you know, the gates of a religious take on how the nation state should be perceived, and how a nation state does have a certain duty towards religion, right? You know, so yeah, I think you are reminding us in a very timely way that perhaps we need to also stop and assess how far this particular pathway will lead us, right? Can we actually break, or can we, or will it be actually all the way to the abyss, right? Because this is the abyss, right, where we actually have a complete mirror of a religious, you know, of a religious state dominated by a priestly class, where and they can use political language even in the 1950s, when they actually asked to be part of the Constituent Assembly, right? You know, as a minority, as a religious minority. But, you know, obviously they finally have a vision of becoming the Karnadhar, or the arbiter of the nation, right? Perhaps not the nation, but you know, so this is not really a nation state as they are talking about, but they're talking about a Sanskriti, which again can ring alarm bells.
Yes, of course.
In the way.
I mean, I would be very happy to talk about the engagements and debates Karpatri has on Sanskrit.
Yeah. So you see, what I would like to perhaps highlight before opening the higher audience should be participating in, I guess. So I'm not going to really hog, you know, the speaker's corner, but let me just quickly add a few things. You see, what I found particularly interesting was that for Karpatri, the Congress, the Hindu Mahasabha, and the Arya Samaj all come in the same bracket,
Yeah.
which is for the Congress, the Arya Samaj and the Hindu Samaj are totally different. But if you actually look at it from the other point of view, they all seem absolutely, you know, chock-a-block, right? And they have similar ideologies for building nation states. So obviously their understanding of the nation state is not at par with either the Congress or their cousin, their cousin, Hindu Mahasabha, or another cousin, disowned of course by the Congress, the Arya Samaj, right? So this is something that I find very, very interesting. What is it that they do not like? Community as envisioned by the Congress, community as envisioned by the Arya Samaj, or community as envisioned by the Hindu Mahasabha, and of course the RSS, of course, right? Okay, so this is what I would like to kind of ask you to maybe come out a little bit more, you know, openly about, right? What kind of community, therefore, would the extreme right position take, right? Obviously, a very orthodox one, as and Sanskriti. I don't think they're really looking at the state as a modern state, right? They're looking at it more as a re-establishment of an authentic Ram Rajya. I think authenticity is what these guys are after. So this is a bit scary as far as I'm concerned. The second point, which I of course, there will be many takes on his take on Varnashrama, his anti-Hindu code bill. I will leave those, nuggets for others, right? There's a lot to chew on in your paper, right? So let me leave those. But I would like to ask one very important question. You see, I am kind of thinking of a position that for modern day Indian polity, it seems like the most comfortable position of history is post 1947. Other pre 1947, the build up to 1947 somehow is a very uncomfortable period, right? And I would like to because you find that all these people are bunching up together from 1948, and it is the decade after independence that somehow seems to have generated this huge contest for position, right? And I would like you to to kind of say upfront, right? Were they comfortable with the colonial state? Because the colonial state and its apparatus, right, would allow them a lot of leeway, which a modern Indian nation state run by an Indian vision of a secular and pluralistic society would not perhaps allow. Thank you. Please, over to you, Malavika, and then I open the discussion to the rest of the audience.
So I think you had two questions, right? One about the question of community.
Yeah.
And if I understand you correctly, you wanted me to sort of talk a bit more about how Karpatri and that particular world of the Bharat Dharma, the Mahamandala and the Varnashram Swarajya.
Also a very Brahminic vision, which is completely
it is very Brahmanic, yes.
synonymous with Hinduism, a Brahminic, a very Brahminic.
It's totally Brahminic. Okay, so first I'd like to, can you hear me? Okay, so to begin with the question of community, there was no unified conception of community. But what I can just at the outset to say, as far as the position that was these organizations that I've talked about were completely dominated. It was a very Brahmanic exposition of politics, of worldview. You can even see in terms of the the different platforms with which they ally, not only before 47 but afterwards. But with regard to the Congress, the Hindu Mahasabha, and the Arya Samaj, they themselves were very complicated organizations. I mean, the Congress itself, after all, had a right wing, right? And so Madan Mohan Malaviya is, in fact, founded the Hindu Mahasabha. And he remained involved in the Hindu Mahasabha until his death in the, in the late 30s. And in fact, he's also, then there are some very important, towards the end of his life, he, in fact, is, though he's not a member, he actually does, he allies with the RSS, right? And he forms a number of platforms with them. And they're one of the issues that the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS and the Congress had less of a problem in this regard. In fact, there were more. What is sort of interesting is right from the 1930s, all these organizations are trying to recruit sannyasis and their monastic networks because they're exceptionally powerful, right? It's much more than the Dandi sannyasis. The Congress, in fact, concentrates on the on the Parahamsa and Naga mutts and akharas, many of whose members, in fact, join the Congress, right? So there are, and some of them are also interestingly sympathetic to the Arya Samaj's view on caste, given the caste struggles taking place within monasticism. So this is something that, Vijay Pinch has shown this very wonderfully for the Ramanandis, where he shows that, in fact, in the 1930s, the Ramanandis split, on the issue of caste. The Sri Vaishnavas and the Ramanandis, in fact, this is the core issue, the question of caste and sampradaya, when they come together, how this shapes the understandings of community, quote unquote, within sampradaya, right? So that is something that is taking place at the same time, but there is no uniform response to the understanding but I can just to distill, if you like, as far as the Brahmin Gosains were concerned. In fact, most Gosains, they in fact were had an antithetical position to the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS and the Arya Samaj, all of which said that Sampradaya had to be subsumed within a hegemonic narrative, and in fact it had to be domesticated. The language that was used was the importance to tame gurus and to tame Sampradaya. And so so their engagement, so in fact many religious traditions in fact did not engage at all with the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS precisely for this reason. And they did not engage with the Arya Samaj, and when they did, it was on very hostile terms. Having said that, it's interesting, other sections engaged with the especially not the Dandis, with the Arya Samaj on the question of caste. Right, but of the three, they found again not the Dandis, but there were some prominent Dandi sannyasis, including one Swami Bharti Tirth, who joins the Congress, and which was seeking to recruit, as I said, like all these political formations, they were very interested in this world of monasticism because they saw the power of devotionalism and bhakti and devotees. I mean, because these mutts had huge numbers, and they were and they had large numbers of there was a kind of, and they were very much part of the public sphere. They were not outside it, so they wanted to draw on this. But for many, the Congress was in fact, despite all its problems, in fact, if you actually look at it, the largest number of sannyasis joined the Congress. Because, but when it came to the 1930s, many of them, including Bharti Tirth, they left the Congress on the question of caste. Right, and then in fact joined hands with the Varnashrama Swarajya Sangh and with Karpatri. So I think in many ways the 1930s is a sort of turning point. There are many debates on, therefore, on what, so when you say community, the idea of community was sort of looked at in terms of the idea of Varnashrama Dharma as a social order, one, and its connection with Sampradaya. So the two were conjoined. But none of these, when I speak of the world of Sampradaya, it is a very heterogeneous one. And there were many who were in fact completely opposed and in fact hostile to Karpatri, Karpatri's exposition, right, of Ram Rajya, precisely because of the importance that it gave to his understanding of this highly Brahmanical reading of Ram Rajya, where he sort of, the world of the Dasnamis is fitted into a certain reading of Orthodox Hinduism. That's sort of to answer your sort of first question. But I also want to say that with regard to the RSS, and particularly the Jansangh after 1951, there were acute debates about community. And because one of the most important questions that was being debated after 47, which I think you're right, it is this extremely, people focus on the period before 47 and then the 50s, but Karpatri's career in fact begins, as it were. He really takes off in 1947 right until the 1970s. Right, and his most intense debates at this point are with the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha and the Jansangh over how his understanding of community and its yoking to a certain understanding of politics, fits into the world of Bharatiya culture, right, and Bharatiya Sanskriti, and it's what is, and so therefore he parts ways with the Jansangh after Deen Dayal Upadhyay publicly rebukes Karpatri, especially when the Jansangh is trying to reinvent itself, and it is trying to actually present itself as a secular front, and which believes in Rashtravad. and did not believe in, and was open to all, to people of all, to members from all communities. Now, this is very different from the Hindu Mahasabha, which under Digvijayanath said that it was only open to Hindus to fight for Hindu Rashtra. So it's interesting that the Jan Sangh at this point in time is trying to walk away, particularly after it was banned for a year. It is trying to disconnect itself from the RSS, which is, but recognize the power and the importance of, these very formidable organizations, because these groups, these associations I'm talking about, in fact, they're political formations, and they are extremely important political voices in the 1930s, because in fact, they're talking head to head with Gandhi, on Ram Rajya, on caste, on Varnashrama Dharma from the 1930s. Then they they cannot be ignored, especially because when they conducted these agitations, the thousands of Dandi sannyasis are arrested, and they are backed by their patrons, right? Who interestingly, until 1947, are supporters of the colonial state, which comes to, Dr. Varghese question. So what was their relationship? In the end, what happens is, with figures like Karpatri, if we actually look at just at the Jan Sangh, which had great hopes of allying with with people like Karpatri and Digvijayanath of the Gorakhnath Mutt, they saw them as important figures in attracting these were really important charismatic leaders and their associations, their sabhas, their bodies, in allying with the Hindu right. But this did not happen because of these fights about community and what Bharatiya Sanskriti is. So what is interesting is that when the VHP is formed in 1964, I argue that it was an effort to domesticate, to do two things. It was a platform which had two actually goals, crudely put. One was to try and domesticate and in some senses reach a working relationship with with these gurus who were very much involved in the public sphere, in politics. They had their own parties, and in fact the Ram Rajya Parishad won elections, right? But what is sort of really interesting is that even after the VHP is formed, Karpatri joins, but he has acute differences, and he then publishes this book, and which echoes the views of many others who are also involved in politics, Brahmin Gosayans like himself, right? And what is sort of interesting is that he said, those who do not know religion and who only worship a flag and the nation as as a deity have no understanding of Sanskriti. So what is sort of interesting is that when we look at Golwalkar's bunch of thoughts, which is published around this time, we see attempts to in fact there's a complete rollback, whereas in earlier works, there is a complete where Savarkar is actually saying, and Golwalkar echoes in, is that in order to achieve this political community of Hindutva, we have to get rid of Hinduism, and we have to get rid of caste, and we have to get rid of Sampradaya. These are the three sort of, but what we see is a shift and an understanding that in order to mobilize these forces, it was important to bring them back. And it was, and I think this is a very important turning point which feeds into the 1980s, right? And which is when the VHP actually gains traction, from the 1980s, when it starts sort of tapping into this extremely powerful world of devotionalism. And where and then of course after that, it takes on different form. So neither of these engagements, and nor can Hindutva then be seen as this very and Hindutva's engagements with these monastic bodies and figures like Karpatri, it is a moving target, and it keeps changing its meaning. What is interesting is that it changes its position on Sampradaya in order to, in fact, accommodate and try to engage with bodies like, like Karpatri and others, and the critique of, the fact that they were Gnostic and that they had no understanding of religion. Now, I don't know if that answers your question, but to go to the question on the colonial state, until 1947, you're quite right. I mean, this is something I didn't get a chance to talk about, but all these bodies were very, very happy with the colonial state. And they did not join the, so just like the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha, which is trying to rewrite its history now, there was absolutely no participation in the anti-colonial struggle. Number two, in fact, there were avid they were avid and consistent from all these bodies. There were statements and adhivations where they invited colonial officials, where in fact they reiterated their loyalism to the British Empire. They also reiterated their the fact that it was actually the British Empire if you like, it's the way it had engaged with religion. It's so-called non-interference in the matter of religion, which had allowed the Bharat Dharma Mahamandala, etc., to flourish, right? So there, and we see this. So whether it was the VSS, whether it was the Bharat Dharma Mahamandala, we actually have right to the 1920s, right to the 1930s, even into the Second World War, there were a large number of yajnas that were held for the British. So there was in fact very little that was said about Gandhi, and when there was a strategic silence. And in fact, all the members, and also because they were being all their patrons and their bhaktas, they were princes who were all members of the Council of State, right? They were all part of, and so they were also, I mean, I don't want to use a crude word like loyalists, but they call themselves loyalists. But by 1946, when the writing on the wall, they become very, very important players and conversationalists in the idea of the Constitution, in imaginaries of the Constitution, and participate very, very avidly. So I think this is something. So which is why this is so which is why in 1948 the Dharmasang says they become very, very important player. Oh, I think there's a time lag. So what I'm saying is that they accept the importance of the Constitution, but in fact they have their own understanding of Bharat, which they want to actually, if you actually look at the Ram Rajya Parishads, they want to work within the Constitution. They want to try and achieve their understanding of Ram Rajya within the Constitution, right? So this is also, I think, very important, because it sort of has many resonances with different times, different places. But there is a right from the 1950s, there is a consistent attack on what is seen as Nehruvian socialism, which is why books like Ram Rajya or Marxwad are published, and Sanmar, which had a very, very wide circulation, in fact, and very wide readership, in fact, had a trenchant critique and kept up a very trenchant critique against the Nehruvian state. And this is something that we have to look at, but we also have to look at how their relationship with and debates about the Constitution within the right are also important. Because the connection that the Jansangh was making between Bharatiya Sanskriti and the Constitution is it's very pertinent in today's times. So what is very interesting is how this was being debated by one of the very important stakeholders. And this was and they parted precisely because they were not able to agree. But that was in the 1950s. But what we do see is I think the VHP is by the 1980s, there is, as the VHP, as the RSS and its constituent bodies, they expand, and in fact they sort of have a different engagement with with this very vibrant and important political world of Sampradaya, right? So I'll sort of leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, very well answered. Thank you very much, Malavika. I would like to ask others in the group to join in the discussion, ask questions if you have them. Otherwise,
Anindita,
I'll have to read out quite a lot of questions here.
Anindita, Dr. Prakash Kumar has a question. Can we let him in?
Yes, please, of course.
Prakash, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Prakash, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me, Malavika?
Yeah, I can.
Yes. Please switch on your video as well.
Oh, okay. I will have to keep it very brief because I have to leave in about 3 minutes. But you may have partly answered my question in the last couple of minutes. So my question was basically about the political space that these folks were trying to create. And you did mention their engagement with others. More specifically, did they ever have a conversation with Gandhians on the notion of Ram Rajya? Or did Nehru ever have anything to say about them? You see, the Nehruvian as a historiographical category is immensely important for 1950s and 1960s.
Very
and you
much.
mentioned that these people are the ones who are hankering after the past, princely traditions. I mean, do they ever specify which princely tradition? There were many. So, I mean, basically, what is the political space that they are trying to create? And lastly, you mentioned that Deen Dayal Upadhyay gave him a public rebuke. And so even after a rebuke from Upadhyay, where they turn into a kind of a political fringe elements, did they have larger significance? And what was that significance? That's all. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll answer very quickly. One, there was not Karpatri himself, but the Varnashra Swarajya Sangh certainly had a long and extended debate with Gandhi on both Ram Rajya and its, and the space and place of Sampradaya and caste, especially around the when Gandhi was touring India.
Great. Which princely tradition were they talking about? Which princely tradition were they talking about?
I'm answering your first question about Gandhi.
I got that part. I'm going to the next question. So when they talk about princely tradition.
So the next question has to do with the princely states. Most of Karpatri's patrons were Jagirdars and Thikanedars from Rajasthan. So but the important thing is there was no particular template. It's not as if they spelled out, but the understanding was of a Dharmarajya in which a princely ruler would actually sort of rule with a Vidvat Parishad of gurus who would have equal standing, right? And but this was not the template that was actually in play in the princely states at all. But so this was an imaginary. However, by after 1948, this understanding shifted, and it shifted to a constitutional framing of if you actually look at the Ram Rajya Parishad and even Karpatri himself. So they did not want to be fringe elements, right? So, and in fact, they were very, very, very clear that they wanted to be central players, and they were never fringe elements. So this is the whole point, whether it was from before independence, before 47 and afterwards, they were central players. The point is that no one has, I think it's unfortunate that they have not been studied. They've been dismissed as fringe elements, which is a different thing, right? So I actually, in many ways, Karpatri had far more, he had a great deal of influence. The Mahamandala the Mahamandala was actually working with Malavika when they were seeking to bring bills in the legislature to, to try and stop what they called reform bills that attacked Hinduism. Right, and so they, in certain ways, they joined hands with the Sanatani. So Malavika took the the Mahamandal and the Varnashrama Swarajya Sangh, who were, interestingly, they had very different views on caste. Right, they were both problematic, but they had for example, Malavika supported temple entry and Karpatri didn't. So they were very much central players. They have not been studied, they've been presented as fringe players. Number three, with regard to the I think you had asked a question about the public rebuke. Despite the public rebuke, no, Karpatri remains, he sort of pretty much, he's stuck to his guns, in fact. And after that, he's arrested again. And then I showed you those, those slides and pictures of this lavish performance, in fact, of the opening of this new temple, which was, which in fact is which many who actually go to Banaras visit.
Thanks,
so
I think you and I are on a panel on Allahabad at Madison. I'll see you there then. I need to leave.
Okay. All right.
Any other question, please?
I think Aloka ma'am has a...
I had a question, but I don't know.
Yeah, Aloka ma'am.
Yeah, I wanted to I wanted to go back to the question of Sampradaya. In 2019 from Columbia, there was the publication of Patton's book on genealogy of devotion, Bhakti, Tantra, Yoga, and Sufism, which talks about, as you also mentioned in your responses to Anindita, that there was Sampradaya was understood in a very kind of heterogeneous sense. In that book, of course, he looks at the Ramanandi sect, and his main argument is that at particular points in history, in this context, in the Mughal context, there is a kind of what should one say, a kind of boundaries begin to be made around Sampradayas, and therefore they begin to address the contextual situation of those periods, right? So I wanted to know from you, I mean, I have a hunch, but maybe you would know this better, that I think that Karpatri in his earlier phase of his life was actually continuing that Sampradaya tradition, except that he wanted to firm up the boundaries of his Sampradaya and separate himself from the Tantra, Yoga, and other Sampradayas because of the sanitization of his own Sampradaya, right? So in a sense, he's part of that genealogy of Bhakti, but he's kind of separating himself because of the contextuality of that particular point in time. And then as modern, I mean, after 47, what he's doing is that he's modernizing the Sampradaya. Whereas my main argument is that I think that we need to also give importance to the other Sampradayas, that is the Naga Sampradaya and the others that had not sanitized themselves. And that, as you also said in your response, were much larger in numbers. They continued those sort of pre-modern elements of the Sampradaya formation and did not sanitize themselves the way Karpatri did. So, I mean, I know your focus of study is him, but I think that maybe a little reflection, a little more reflection on the Sampradaya tradition, because Sampradaya is not equated to one caste and one Sampradaya often. I mean, this has a long history. I don't want to go into that. I just want to, that early part of his career and the way he's separating himself from that larger genealogy of devotion, because you see, at that, Ramanandis did the same thing, no? They also took up the Vaishnavite tradition, right? So, and here, they're excluding. What I'm saying is that they're excluding Sampradayas. So there is this, and then there's modernity, right? So you further firm up the bhakti notion within caste, within a particular notion of Hinduism, or within a particular sect. So if you can just reflect a bit on how this heterogeneity of the existence of various sampradayas may or may not have impacted him. I mean, I don't know. You know better.
Well, that's a very good question. Thank you. But I mean, with specific reference to this talk, I restricted myself to, this particular, obviously, to Karpatri, but I did say that he comes from a longer genealogy, and I totally agree with you. I mean, and in fact, the attempt to homogenize Sampradaya is not new to the colonial period, but it takes different shapes and it takes different forms. So there is, if you like, that I'm not trying to in many ways we have to understand the particularity of the colonial moment, and we have to understand the particularity of the post-colonial moment, and that to the 50s is very different from the 80s. But having said that, I mean, if we just look at there is the we know that whether it was the Nath Yogis or whether it was the Dashnamis, the attempt, the formulaic and the hagiographical representation of these neat and bounded panths is not how they function on the ground. And whether it was the Naths or whether it was the Ramanandis, or whether it was they were fluid bodies who were constantly changing, and the attempts were being made to and in fact that has been written about, I think, for the period in the 18th century, whether it's Vasudha Parashivan or Paramashivan, sorry, or and Vijay Pinch and a whole range of others. And they make it very clear that even in the 18th century, Jai Singh of Amer, in fact, tries to, interestingly, homogenize Vaishnavism only, right? But very unsuccessfully. So there's an attempt to create I wouldn't say a pan Vaishnava, but he tries to create a pan Vaishnava model of the Chatur Sampradaya, which in fact is never followed. And as I think, as Jack Hawley also points out, I mean, this is something that is much more. We have to this assumption that these Sampradaya had these bounded. They worked within these bounded panths over homogeneous is something that has to be re-examined very carefully, because that is a highly problematic. So yes, I agree with you, attempts were made to homogenize, but the attempt to try and homogenize them in the colonial period is it is a continuation of, but it is also part of a new enterprise where there are new definitions of Samaj. And and there are also new models, particularly in the Ramakrishna mission, which is actually propagating an understanding of of a monastic model of citizenship, which is actually much more, I would say, which was actually which was held out to those to the members of these various sampradaya by the Congress and so on, as monks who in fact transcend their sectarian movement. I'm using the word sectarian in inverted commas. Their sectarian movement, and in fact are dedicated to the seva of the nation. Right now, what is sort of interesting is that while these various sampradaya at this point in time, they're also forming by the end of the 19th century every single guru parampara order, every single, and then there are mahasabhas. They are trying to homogenize, they're trying to set their own house in order, because in fact there is no homogeneity even amongst the panths. Because if you talk of the 10 panths of the Dasnamis, there is no homogeneity. There is a heterogeneity of practices, and this is being so they're trying to formalize, and this is not very successful. So the boundaries, so this attempted of boundedness is very interestingly, and it's also done for the Nath Yogis, right? And which are very fascinating religious tradition, which leak across in different ways. Because I mean, when I was looking in my chapter on the Gorakhnath Mutt, I sort of show, in fact, the Gorakhnath Mutt moves away from the Nath Yogi tradition. In fact, out of the Bara Panths of the Nath, 6 were actually what the colonial ethnographers call Musalman Panths. So and in fact these panths keep proliferating even in the 19th century. So it's not the attempt to bound them is on paper. So, but at the same time, which is why these associations, one of their the attempt is to kind of try and bound them so that to create this in some senses to create to try and deal with the critique of the Arya Samaj and so on and so forth, that that they have no that they were steeped in obscurantism, and to present themselves as rational, modern subjectivities, right? So there is
everybody,
but
Arya Samaj, Hindu Mahasabha, RSS, all of them.
yeah. So but
exercise these elements from within the very vibrant and very heterogeneous traditions of
Yes.
of the Nagapanthis and the others, other social groups. I don't know whether, I just want a small point for you to highlight, and that is that if we extrapolate the Karpatri story, maybe we can also reflect on this heterogeneity which coexisted with that. That's my main point.
Yeah, so that's I actually sorry to interrupt, but actually Karpatri himself does not, he very strategically actually he does not disconnect himself. He sanitizes one part of his his public face where he presents himself as a smartha, and not a Shaiva. And so, in fact, when you go to the Dharmasang office today, when asked, he will say the Dashnamis are not Shaivas; they are actually Smarthas. But if you actually talk to other, if you talk to those who are not Dandis, they will self-identify as Shaiva. But what is interesting is that even the Dandi sannyasis and Karpatri himself, he it's not as if he sanitizes his practices. He is very much immersed in, not only in the realm of the Dandi mathas, but also in practices of, because the Dandi sannyasis are not divorced from Shakta and tantric practices, and Karpatri is also very much part of that, and he in fact is a practitioner. It's just that he chooses not to talk about it. It is also in order to and what he is doing in terms of appropriating and in fact sort of going with the flow of the idioms and language of Vaishnavism is also something that a lot of other Shaivas are doing at this point in time. But and that Vijay Pinch has pointed out very brilliantly. So, but this at the same time, it does not mean that either eschew these practices with very few exceptions. They remain and continue to be, to be extremely sort of not just heterogeneous, but these religious practices of the Dandis also even now. There are certain mutts which are known as tantric mutts in Banaras even today. So it's not as if, so that Karpatri is trying to actually deal with a lot of conversation about asceticism in the 19th century, which at once valorizes it as nationalist, as an aspiration of a nationalist masculinity, but wants to purge it, right, of
the warrior
the warrior, no, but wants to purge it of its connections with lived religious practice and its heterogeneity. And what we find very interesting is that so, but Karpatri at the same time, though he's committed politically and otherwise to the Ramcharitmanas, which is, as I said, emerges as one and as Gurdjieff points out, it becomes a very important text for the Sanatanis, as presenting a template for the orthodox way of life, and it's been very differently interpreted. So if we look at the way in which the Ramcharitmanas was interpreted during the Kisan Sabha movement, right, it is a very different appropriation from that of Karpatri. It's completely so I think so this realm of heterogeneity and this realm of lived is actually still, if you look at the Dasnamis today, they're still extremely heterogeneous. If you look at the Nathpanthis today, they're still, but so it is not as if all of them follow the prescriptives of the Gorakhnath Math. You know, though some of them, for example, may have walked away from public they walked away from Balidan, which was an intrinsic part of, for example, of puja in many of the mutts and shrines. Some of them are bad, but in fact, in some very important temples that I visited, which are actually attached, for example, and here I'm not talking of Karpatri, I'm talking of the Nathvantis. I'm talking of the Shakti Peeth of Devi Patan. There actually is there is a huge sign saying "Yahan Balidan karna mana hai." And I said, why do you need this sign? He said, because we are trying to stop it and it is not possible. So you see, it is, I think we also have to recognize that in many ways, this world of lived religious practice is very, very complex. And if we just look at the Arya Samaj and we just look at, the Hindu Mahasabha, or we work within this paradigm of reform and revivalism, I think we do not see these things. We have to understand the world of devotionalism also, and the word bhakti also can mean so many things, right? Because bhakti is invoked also by Karpatri, and it's also invoked in different ways by the, it's politicized and invoked in different ways by the Ravidasis who are actually opposing. So it's a field that we have to study, but it is very much mainstream. And I think we need to make it mainstream. We need to make this, and we have to understand religiosity in its own terms, understand the categories and how they are sort of connected, and not just see them as flat, empty political readings. I think that is where we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you.
I think Anandita will close it here. I think we are getting late.
I know we are getting really late. We could continue. But
maybe I don't know. Maybe there are.
There's a question here.
Swarupa has a question. This would be last, but Malavika, you also be very brief.
Bhangya, may I suggest something? Because there are 2 questions from our students in the chat box. Maybe we can attend to that as well.
Can you, Malavika, attend them?
I'll be very short. I'll be very short.
Yeah, because you've been elaborating too much.
Sorry.
Yeah. Dr. Swarupa.
Yeah.
Malavika, your presentation is very lucid and clear. It's given the Banaras caste politics and construction of a nation in a very cleared way. And recently, when Babri Masjid was the puja ceremony took place, the Mahamandaleshwar from Dalit Mahamandaleshwar was not allowed to come to the puja. So the background of it can be understood through your presentation, I feel. So one thing about, I totally agree with the Professor Aloka Parashar, what she said about the Panth culture and the homogeneity of the Dharma and Sanatana Dharma and Panth culture in a northern belt. This whole northern belt has this Panth culture, Gorakhnath Panth and various Panth cultures, and which are very, very strong. And as you presented, not only a particular caste follows, but all caste groups do follow it. And I was also looking into this Panth culture since 20 years. So anyway, my question is, when these monasteries, these Panth cultures, in the name of Samskruti and Dharma, were trying to construct the nation, and creating consciousness of the nation.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they were totally excluding the caste within. And maybe that is one of the fundamental variations in especially in northern belt we do come across, wherein the Adi Dharma movement and Ravidasyas, they do oppose, and for contrary to the Rama Rajya the concept of the Rama Rajya, they bring in the parallel, this what is another parallel nation, construction of a nation, that is what is Begumpura. So I would like to focus your views on the construction of a nation through Begumpura. I would like to focus on.
Begumpura, I'm sorry. I'm going to try and answer your question. Yes,
And
certain.
one more question. Yes, that is one with regard to the nation, and another is very interesting. Just Dandi Pants are Brahmins, precisely Vaishnavites, and they have their own.
They're not Vaishnavites. They're Smarthas. That's different.
Smarthas, okay, Smarthas. But Paramahamsas and Nagas are Shaivites, and they are associated with Akhadas. And I feel in some of my research, I came across the references of the Paramahamsas and Nagas who are associated with Akhadas are used in the partition of India to work to, for a communal, for the creation of communal rights. And mostly the Dalits, Shudras and untouchables were used because they are already trained in Akhadas, and they are used for at the time of partition for the communal rights. What is your opinion?
Okay. So these are, I'll try and be as quick as possible. Now, as far as the, there are many, again, I just want to say that all these groups were not fringe elements. So what is interesting is that their construction of nation, whether it was the Bharat Dharma Mahamandala, is also very similar to a lot of the Orthodox Hindu constructions of nation, which were mainstream and were very, very problematic regarding caste. So so even the all these, in fact there were many, caste is a fracture which even amongst these, so what this thing that we call Brahminism is actually very, it is also very, it is a field which is very, where there were fraught debates about the space and place of and how Varnashrama Dharma would shape nation. And there were also opponents to this amongst the Sanatanis. So precisely for the reason saying that this would not get political traction, right? Yep. So number one. So clearly, and yes, I agree with you. I mean, it is precisely because of this that someone like Digvijayanath, for example, he in fact, but he changes the idea of the Nathpanthi order. I mean, in his understanding, he sort of makes it into a Hindu. He redefines what it is, but his understanding of the nation, which is also it's problematic. He espouses the views of Savarkar, right? But he's which is also exclusionary. So in fact, in this period, while these before 47, I would say that with regard to caste, with regard to even the understanding of Hindu nation, interesting. It was marginal compared to compared to the Congress and so on and so forth. It was being debated. But and Malavika himself, as I said, he was talking of a nation, the idea of a nation state where Varnashrama Dharma could be accommodated. We also know that outside this, Gandhi himself had this debate with Ambedkar, right? On so I totally agree with you. I mean, this remains unresolved. But the second thing to do with to emphasize that many of these these Mahamandaleshwaras, and in fact what is interesting is Karpatri's influence amongst the the other Pants and the mathas, not just in Banaras but outside grows, which is they are continue to be, and even sort of what is interesting about Karpatri is that he presents himself as a Smartha, but then he's also a Shaiva. So it's sort of interesting because this so he does play with many of his, many parts of this language. He does do that. But to answer your question about yes, there was a lot of opposition, and in fact from 30s, the Mahamandala, the Varnashrama Swarajya Sangh, and later on the Dharmasang is complicit in caste violence. Right, which is, and this is not, we're not talking of the world of print, we're not talking of the world of but of public debate, but we're talking of, this is the period of escalating caste conflict, right, between where, particularly around temples, where and right from the 30s and after. So and after 1947, when Karpatri sort of opposes the entry of Dalits to the Kashi Vishwanath temple, there are riots, right? So I mean, he's put in prison many times. So, and finally, yes, there is I haven't been able to talk about Karpatri's engagement in communal. So this is the one space and one area where, interestingly, Karpatri engages wholeheartedly with the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha, right? And which is in the realm of communal politics. And he's also, along with Karpatri, one of the first people who actually makes the claim that all mosques that are disputed sites, including Babri Masjid, needed to be returned to the Hindus, right? But that, in fact, is not something that was, he participates in the Hindu Mahasabha's Akhand Bharat campaign, for example.
Okay.
Right? And so on.
Yeah, let it be. Right. We have some questions. Should we mail it to the recipients? We are really running out of time. Bhangya, what do you suggest?
I think there are two questions.
Shall we read out? Because Chitran's question is talking about the body. And
I looked at it. I'm looking at it.
Can we quickly take that? Because
can you respond to that, Malavika?
Yeah, please.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
we'll close it.
Then we end.
Yes. So I'm going to make a sort of general comment. When one talks about a social order, it is totally. I have sort of been very reductionist out of the interest of time, though I seem to have talked a little too much. But the thing is that this was the question of Varna was being discussed as the question of lived practice, and which had everything to do with the question of touch, the question of who was allowed in spaces, the question of commensality, and who was considered pure and who was considered impure. So absolutely. So the idea of the framing of, in many senses, the political language of citizenship, right, which this was being framed by Karpatri, and using the language of Varnashrama Dharma was a coding of who would be a citizen. And who would be a citizen who was allowed into certain spaces on the basis of what he called the orthodox way of life, and whose bodies were pure and whose were impure. So there is very much a conversation about the bodies of Dalits, right, which is very much encoded in his conversations about Varnashrama Dharma and the idea of what he calls the lived orthodox Hindu way of life, where the Dalits are always, and Dalit bodies are always presented as the other, but they are presented as part of what he called a Hindu community, but who had to, in terms of space and in terms of touch, they had to, according to Karpatri, had to remain as part of what he called, they were an ang or a hissa of Hinduism, but had to sort of, in terms of lived practice, whether it not just within sacred spaces like temples, but even outside, only do those tasks that were allocated to them. The word he keeps calling them antajas. So the term that he uses is a very important one. And in terms of touch, he says it was very important. The idea of Shuddh was very important to him. So the only Shuddh body actually were Brahmanical bodies, right? And this is something that was also instituted even within the Dashnamis, because the Nagas, for example, and the Akhadas and the and many of the devotees came from different castes, right? As some as Swarupa she reminded me, and that's very important. Having said that, there were very clear lines of definition and boundary, and there was a lot of opposition, and Karpatri again was complicit in violence on Dalit bodies
Okay, I
in the
think,
temple entry movement.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, Vijay, can you please give the vote of thanks? Or
Okay,
should
thank
I?
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Professor Malavika Kasturi. It's quite fascinating talk. It's not about, the Ramrajya is more like a exclusive. It reminds me of, segregation like antebellum South in North American colonial times.
Yeah.
So in case of India, it's more like related to caste and religion, right? It's quite fascinating. You have illuminated a very important segment of the history of maths in Northern India. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining this talk. It's quite illuminating. Thank you, Professor Malavika.
Okay, thank you, Malak.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malavika.